Well, now we'll go back to Egypt and to discuss the extraordinary political situation. We're joined now in our London studio by Fawaz Gerges, Professor of Middle Eastern Politics and International Relations at the London School of Economics. Professor Gerges, welcome to the programme and many thanks for joining Late Line.
My pleasure.
Anti-government protesters have dubbed today a day of departure. Will it be? Is today the day?
Well, I think today is very pivotal. It's very pivotal not only because you have hundreds of thousands of Egyptians are back on the streets, but there is also the potential that they might march on to the presidential palace where Mubarak is. So this is a big development today. And the crowd is very fired up, as you well know, because of what the thugs did to the protesters yesterday in the last 48 hours. They turned against the crowd and several people were killed, hundreds injured. But I think there's also a second parallel channel taking place. That is, the army is thinking very hard about what to do, the next step. And obviously the Americans have made up their mind. The Americans have been pushing the army very hard that Mubarak must go. So the Americans and the army seem to have come to a conclusion that President Hosni Mubarak has become a liability. A liability for Egypt, a liability for the army, and a liability for American and Western interests. It seems to me the momentum against Mubarak, whether he stays one day or two, but obviously he is on his way out sooner rather than later.
How did you read that statement today that he made to ABC America that he does want to go, but he can't because it would mean chaos? How do you interpret that he will hold on until the bitter end?
Well, I think, as you all know, that statement plus his speech, his last on Sunday, it was a defiant speech, defiant statement that he said he was a man of the land and he will die on the land. Mubarak, everyone who knows Mubarak says that he is a military man. He will fight to the end. That's who he is. But the reality is the momentum is overwhelming. The momentum is crushing. And the Americans now are really exerting a lot of pressure, not just against Mubarak, but also telling the military that Mubarak is a huge liability. I read the statement in the following. I think he has come, obviously, to the conclusion that he is on his way out. What he's trying to do is that as long as the army, as long as the establishment finds a way out, a transitional process, I am willing to go. And I think that particular statement tells me that he has come to the conclusion that once the military tells him that, Mr. President, please, it's for the sake of Egypt, go, he will go. Keep in mind that Mubarak is not the Tunisian President Ben Ali. Mubarak is an integral part of the army institution. He was the head of the Air Force in the 1973 war, the most celebrated Egyptian-Israeli war. So the army wants to find an honorable exit, a face-saving formula. Everything that has been happening in the last few days tells me that the army is trying to position itself to nudge Mubarak out, but with as little damage, not only to Egypt, but also to the institution of the army, because
Indeed.
The army has so much vested interest invested in Mubarak.
Indeed it does, and of course it would be moving against one of its own. But if it comes to some sort of face-saving solution to this, and this idea of a transitional government, which there are reports the US government is in active negotiations with Mubarak on, what form could it take?
Well, I think, remember, in the last 7 days, the army has put its own man in power. I mean, Mubarak is not in charge anymore. He's a figurehead. I mean, let me give you a roadmap, what I'm talking about. The Vice President, General Umar Sulaiman, was appointed. He is the man now who's charged. He's everywhere. You have the Prime Minister, Ahmed Shukri. He is also a general. You have the Interior Ministry, an army general, and the Defense Minister, Mr. Tantawi. So really the army is in charge. I think what we're talking about is negotiations between the army and the opposition forces. Yesterday there was a major statement by Vice President Sulaiman. He invited the Muslim Brotherhood, the most powerful religiously based movement in Egypt, to even get involved in the diplomatic and the talks with the government. To go on this particular, to go that far, this tells me that Sulaiman and the army are preparing to engage the opposition in a serious dialogue in order to establish what I call a unity front, a national unity government after the exit of Mubarak in the scene in the next few days.
At the same time, Professor Gerges, there seems no clear leader of these anti-Mubarak forces. You talk about the Muslim Brotherhood, and yet, I mean, they're actually an outlawed party, or they have some support, but other people question how strong that is. We have Mohammed al-Baradei, but of course he spent an enormous amount of time outside Egypt. When it comes to putting together some sort of coalition, if you like, is there a clear leader, and who would make up these opposition forces?
I think you have raised a very, very critical question, and that's why the international community, in particular the Americans, are very anxious about transitioning. How do you transition to a national unity front? Who are the forces from the opposition that basically who would lead the transitional front? So you have what I call a rainbow coalition of oppositional forces. Mohammed al-Baradei, the Nobel Prize winner, has emerged as the public face of the opposition. He seems to be an acceptable choice even for the Muslim Brotherhood, that is the most powerful Islamist movement. You have also Al-Wafd party. Al-Wafd is the oldest party in Egypt, older than the Muslim Brotherhood. You have nationalists, you have secularists, you have leftists and independent Islamists. Unfortunately, the opposition is very fragmented. The opposition does not really have a consolidated, a solid vision or program. And this is why it's going to take a few months, if not a year or so, for the opposition to put its house in order, if it can, in order to negotiate with the army. And that's what the army and the Americans want. They want an orderly and peaceful transition that lasts at least a year to enable the opposition and civil society to mobilize its forces in order to have elections. Because if you were to have elections today, the Muslim Brotherhood would gain a sizable segment of the population. Neither the army, nor the Americans, nor the international community want this particular outcome if elections were to happen in the next few weeks.
So do you believe that this sort of coalition of forces can come together peacefully, given what we've seen in the square over recent days? There are, as you've said, there are enormous numbers of people flowing into the square as we speak. We've heard just earlier, prior to this interview, that the army now seems to be more organised, taking a more active role. But do you believe this can happen peacefully?
Well, remember, there is no security vacuum in Egypt. The army is in charge. The army is the most respected and powerful institution. So any security vacuum will be filled by the army. The question is political. The dilemma of Egypt is political and economic. And at the end of the day, any particular coalition that emerges will be basically dependent on the army. Even the Muslim Brotherhood knows this. Even Mohammed al-Baradei knows this. Even the nationalists and the Democrats know this. So the reality is, as soon as Egyptians, as soon as the army and the opposition finds a formula, I think Egypt will be on its way, at least for a transitional government. In fact, my argument is that Egypt's problems will begin on the day of the formation of a national unity government. Egypt has tremendous, massive problems, economic and political. Most of Egyptian institutions have been decimated in the last 30 years, and that's why I said to you, the army is the most respected institution. It should not be. You should have a parliament, you should have civil society. 40% of the 82 million Egyptians live either in poverty or below the poverty lines, on less than $2. You have millions of Egyptians who cannot afford 6 loaves of bread. This is how bad it is. There is no productive base. Egypt hardly produces anything at this particular moment. So really, Egypt's problems begin on the day of transitioning to a new government, and I really feel sorry for the new leaders that they're going to take Egypt to the 21st century, because the problems are enormous, and Egypt's, in fact, challenges will be with us for the next 20, 30 or even 40 years.
And where does that leave the US, which of course has been such a powerful supporter of Mubarak and put their money where their mouth is to the tune of some $2 billion a year? The pivotal role that Mubarak has played in the region. Of course, the US is now pushing for a transitional government, but should they fear what will come next?
Well, I think, unfortunately, the reality is American foreign policy has embedded itself with dictators and authoritarian leaders. That is, stability topped all other concerns, including the rule of law and human rights and institutional building. And the American dilemma has become very clear in the Arab world in the last few weeks, what I call the Arab Intifada. The Arab Revolution has exposed the limits of American foreign policy, that America invested in the wrong people. And the reality is, at the end of the day, will America take the big lessons out of this particular crisis? Will America begin the process of investing in civil society? Of course there are risks. There are tremendous risks. But the reality is, I would argue, you have to start from somewhere. And the United States and the Western community, including Australia, must invest in the hopes and the aspirations of the people, must be on the right side of the history, because Mubarak not only has been a liability for Egypt, but Mubarak's presence and policies have been very counterproductive to Western and American interests in Egypt, because Egyptians and Arabs believe that basically the United States and the West support Mubarak.
Well, Professor Gerges, it's certainly momentous times for the region. You're losing your voice. That's an apt time for us to conclude the interview. Many thanks for making the time to talk to us.
Pleasure.